their den, where they flee for safety. Jeremiah says, you have turned worship into a refuge from justice. You think as long as you make it to the temple and say, the temple, whew, we're safe. We made it. God can't get us now. Then says God, I will destroy the temple, so you can't do that. And by the way, it almost cost Jeremiah his life. That's what Jesus is doing. He's not cleansing the temple. There's nothing to be cleansed. The people who are, changing money and everything else are the normal fiscal basis of the temple. They're not doing anything wrong. What he is doing is far more drastic. He's saying, in the name of Jeremiah, you have made worship an excuse from justice, and I'm shutting down the shop. That's what's happening. When he overturns the money changers, he destroys, symbolically of course, the fiscal basis of the temple. The temple cannot survive without the donations from all over the Jewish world. Nothing wrong has been done there. But Jesus says, you have turned my temple into a den of thieves. Do not think the people are thieving. What they have done is said, well, God's primarily interested in worship. Justice is kind of like outreach. We should do some of that stuff too. But basically it's about worship. God says, I will destroy my temple. These are parabolic actions by Jesus. Actions by Jesus. They're parables. They're intended again to make us think. And to make us think not just about Rome and the temple, but about ourselves in our modern world. What about parables about Jesus? To be honest with you, I don't even know where to begin. Almost the entire New Testament is filled with parables about Jesus. Of course, Jesus existed. Of course. And was crucified. But the parables take all of that and tell you what it means. Examples. We say Jesus walked on the water. And right away, after the post-Enlightenment, we all want to argue about that. Did he really do it? Nobody can do that sort of stuff. I don't believe that. Now, when in doubt, read the text. This is a new concept that Marcus and I have invented. It's called reading the text. Because you never know what you're going to find in there. It's a story, first of all. It doesn't simply say Jesus walked on water. It's a story. It doesn't say he was kind of hungry and he lit out across the lake to get home for supper. It doesn't. It tells you a story. So the first thing when you're reading a story is read the story. Usually the disciples hang out with Jesus, like moss on a tree. They're there all the time. In this case, Jesus sends them off in the boat by themselves. Quite deliberate. They're out there in the middle of the lake and they're rowing like mad and they're getting nowhere. Now, don't confuse this with the storm in the sea. This is not about the storm. It's a different story. In this story, they're just rowing like mad and they're getting nowhere. The wind's too strong against them. Then Jesus comes out walking on the waters. Yeah, no question. This is a miracle in a parable. He's walking on the waters. He's not coming out to help them. He's like out for an early morning stroll. Then they cry out. This is the kicker line. They cry out, and immediately Jesus gets into the boat, and everything was fine. Now, when I read that story, it screams at me. I'm a parable dummy. And what does it mean then, as I try to think about it? It means that by the middle of the first century, they knew the church might try and take off without Jesus in the boat. The 12, who are the symbols of the church, the 12 who represent the leadership of the church or the church itself. When they take off without Jesus in the boat, they row like mad and get nowhere. Lots of activity, no progress. It's like a rocking chair. That's a parable, and it bites. Now, do you see why it's much safer? Let's discuss whether Jesus could walk on water or not. Another one. And by the way, the person who made that up, made it up completely as a parable. Made it up as much, I think, as Jesus made up the Good Samaritan. And would probably be horribly surprised at hearing us debating whether Jesus could walk on water. Say, you're missing the point. Multiplication of the loaves and fishes. Read the whole story. They're out in a desert place. They've spent the whole day preaching, no problems. It's not about starving people. It comes to the end of the day, and the disciples say, the 12 say to Jesus, send them away to get something to eat. Send them away. The biblical basis of the fast food industry. Send them away. That's their solution. And then Jesus comes up with this weird counter-proposal, you give them to eat. And they almost laugh at him. In fact, they do laugh at him. 200 denarii wouldn't pay for this whole crowd. So we have two opposing viewpoints. Send them away, give them to eat. And then something extraordinary happens in this story when you make the mistake of reading the whole story. The 12 are pulled kicking and screaming into the middle of the story. Normally they're on the side, Jesus is performing a miracle, and they're going, wow. They're not in the middle. In this case, every step of the way, Jesus forces them to do it. He says, go see if there's any food. I'm reading Mark's Gospel. When John tells that same story, by the way, John gets embarrassed that Jesus doesn't know. And he said, he just did it to test them. No. Mark got it right. He forces them to go out and find out how much food is there, and as you know, they find the loaves and the fishes. Then he tells them to have the people sit down. Then, this is terribly important, he takes the bread and the fish, and he blesses, breaks, gives. These are the Eucharistic terms. Takes, blesses, breaks, gives. This is a Eucharist. And he has the disciples hand out to the people. Now, by this stage, you're really getting it. Jesus isn't doing it directly with the people. He's forcing them into the middle. And, of course, you all know at the end there's more than you could ever imagine left over. And guess who picks up the remnants? Them. So when I read it, I think I get it, I think. The church, or the leadership of the church, however you see the 12, are all in favor of preaching, but not in favor of the distribution of food. That's not their business. Send them away. And Jesus forces them to run the show. He forces them into the middle. Find out, sit down, give, all the rest of it. And then there's another thing. Scholars often say, well, this is like the manna in the desert. Jesus, is bringing... Wait a minute. It's not. Jesus takes the food that is actually there, and as it passes through his hands, there's enough for everyone. He doesn't turn stones into food, and he doesn't bring manna down from heaven. The food that is already there is absolutely enough for everyone, with lots left over when it passes through the hands of divine justice. It ain't about multiplication, it's about distribution. And both of those, I think, are absolutely deliberately, intentionally made up parables. Two more. Two final ones. Climactic ones, again, moving towards the end of Lent and Holy Week. One is from Mark, the other is from John. Both of them center on Pilate. And Pilate is one of the most important characters in the entire New Testament to understand Jesus. Because Pilate got it precisely right. Pilate crucified Jesus but didn't round up his followers. Which tells us two things. I'm now talking history. Which tells me two things. As far as Pilate was concerned, Jesus was a non-violent resistor. He would not have crucified him publicly, wasted an afternoon squad of soldiers and iron nails on Jesus if he was just a minor nuisance. He'd have booted him out of town. He publicly, officially, legally executed him. That means he was resisting Roman law and order. But he made no attempt to round up his followers, which means he did not consider him violent. For example, look at the parable created in Mark's Gospel, where Pilate stands there with Barabbas and with Jesus, with two revolutionaries, as it were. One of them is a violent revolutionary. So Barabbas is in jail, says Mark, with all his followers. And Jesus, of course, is not in jail with all his followers. So Mark sets up a parable that contrasts the violent revolutionary and the non-violent revolutionary. And both of them, of course, are doing it in the name of their God. The other one, in John. It's the one place in Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ where a very faint smile, I think, flickered across my face. I couldn't by that stage do much more than faint smile. It's the scene in John between Jesus and Pilate, totally parabolic, not historical. But in Mel Gibson's rendition, Pilate says to Jesus in Aramaic, he kind of talks down to Jesus by talking Aramaic, which of course Pilate would never have done, even wouldn't have known it. And Jesus comes right back in Latin. What's the conversation? Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world." You all know the phrase. And normally we tend to stop at that point, which leaves it completely ambiguous. My kingdom is not of this world. It's of the heavens, way up there. Don't worry, Pilate, it's nothing to do with you. My kingdom is not of this world. It's not of the present. It's of the future. Again, don't worry, Pilate. No problem. Or my kingdom is of the interior spiritual life and not also of the external political life. Again, no worry, Pilate. And then Jesus spoils the whole thing by going on, as Jesus tends to do so often. My kingdom is not of this world. If it were of this world, my companions would be in here fighting to get me out. Nothing could be climactically clearer. The difference, says Jesus, between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of Rome is violence. That's what it comes down to. The difference between my kingdom, the kingdom of God, and your kingdom, Pilate, the kingdom of Rome, is that yours is based on violence, and I will not even use violence to get out of here. In conclusion, parables by Jesus, parables about Jesus, parables based on things that happened, parables totally invented. When you look at them all, it finally occurs to you, Jesus is the parable of God. That's what's going on. All these others are little like butterflies to a summer. The real, clear parable is that Jesus is the parable of God. The life, the death, the resurrection of Jesus is the parable of God. And therefore, since Jesus was nonviolent, God is nonviolent. And that's what we really don't like. We want a violent God. Violent against other people, of course, but definitely violent. And we will invent a second coming and have Jesus come back and do it violently because we are profoundly dismayed by the first one. We don't like the incarnation. The whole history of Christianity is flight from incarnation. Jesus is the parable of God, and we want a different God. "O Lord," said Shakespeare's Puck, "what fools these mortals be." Thank you.